Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the first of what could be many video lectures that take us through this interruption to our normally scheduled classes. Today I just want to finish up what we were discussing on Tuesday, which was the collapse of the Qing dynasty. And the thing that I want you to have as a takeaway for what we were trying to get across in this lecture is that after the Boxer uprising, the Qing turned to a number of different avenues to both modernize its country, revamp its governance, and solidify its control over China. And those three avenues were largely the creation of a new army modeled along Western lines, railways, which would speed up communication, the deployment of those troops in conflicts with foreign powers such as the West, and then also against domestic uprisings against Qing rule, but also commerce and to create a more mobile, affluent society. And then lastly, a constitution, which is in some ways what we're touching on with Fairbank saying that really in trying to grant new forms of political participation and channels for classes like the scholar gentry, but even commoners, and a lot of people that are becoming educated and affluent through their contact with foreign powers from the West, that the Qing really lose control over the political life of the country, and that their governance comes under great scrutiny, that they lose the loyalty of the elite classes, which is really the major difference between this era and the Taiping Rebellion, when the Qing managed to weather a severe challenge to their rule, in part because a lot of elites rallied to them. Okay. And what's making the political life of China so volatile are a number of new groups. Okay. We were talking last time about the fact that you have these nationalist dissidents who are very critical of the Qing and pressuring them for reform, such as Kong Yao-wei, Liang Qichao, and even insiders such as Yan Fu, pictured here where my mouse is kind of scrambling around his head. Okay. And they're floating the ideas that the only ways the Qing can survive this tumultuous era of external pressure and domestic criticism and rising rebellion is if they turn to a new style of governance that borrows ideas from the West, such as constitutionalism and democracy, although we've talked about how the Chinese are interpreting and translating democracy to mean something that's far different than what it means in America at the time. Another political force, though, is not just national dissidents who are critical of the Qing, but the very strident new forms of modern politicians we see. That's best exemplified by Sun Zhongshan or Sun Yat-sen, who's built upon the tradition of secret societies and kind of anti-Manchu activities to found really China's first modern political party, the Revolutionary League, which allies in Japan in 1905 with all these different secret societies and sects and political groups. And they're like masters of traditional forms of Chinese politics, such as the use of secret societies and kind of militancy, and the new politics. They're good at fundraising, they're good at borrowing and developing strong patronage networks among the overseas Chinese scattered across North America and Southeast Asia. They use newspapers and magazines to mobilize and organize the masses, and they're especially popular among those students sent to become modernizers. Students that the Qing are investing in as a means to create an industrial economy and a more modern form of government and military, and these secret societies and new political parties such as the Revolutionary League are winning them over in droves in places like Tokyo. Pictured here next to Sun Zhongshan is an example of his success in fundraising. He's going to secure the patronage early on in his career in the early 1900s of one Charlie Song, who actually is kind of a stowaway on a ship that goes to the United States, where eventually he ends up in places like Tennessee and North Carolina, gaining a college education through missionaries that hope he's going to go back and convert a lot of Chinese people to the Bible and to Christianity. which he does, but he actually finds a far greater success as an entrepreneur and a businessman. Also things that he learned from his studies in America, and amasses an enormous commercial empire connecting places like Shanghai, organized gangs, and also industrialists in the United States, manufacturing noodles and Bibles and exporting them to China. And he's become perhaps the wealthiest man in all of China by the 1910s and 1920s, and supportive of Sun Zhongshan. And we're going to get to his three daughters, famously are going to take differing sides in the coming war between the nationalists and the communists, and are immensely influential on the course of China's political destiny in the 20th century through their relationships with their husbands, or as one of Song's daughters, Song Meiling, is going to show, through their own political careers. Okay, and that's something we'll come back to when we get to the 1930s and 1940s. What makes these modern politicians really skilled in organizing and rallying people to their ideas about the Manchu being expelled, about standing up a republic, about expanding rights and participation for common people, is that they're skilled orators. And in that capacity, no one's perhaps better than the martyr Qiu Jin, who is living kind of a typical Chinese woman's life in southern China for many years, until she takes chance of this opportunity to go abroad, leaving behind her husband, who's very abusive and oppressive, and two children to go study and find a formal education in Japan. And it's there that she eventually joins political societies, including the Revolutionary League, and she becomes kind of an icon of the new nationalist movement and the quest for a republican democracy. She's famed for wearing like Western-style male suits. She's a journal editor. She loves martial arts and combat. But most importantly for modern politics, she is a passionate, skilled speaker who's going to, if not convince many people that China deserves a republic in the 20th century, or that women deserve rights such as the freedom to marry, they deserve equal access to education, or that foot binding is an outdated and oppressive system and should be abolished. She, if nothing else, inspires them, incites them, or disturbs them. And this is where these classes that aren't traditional powers, they're not from the families that are well educated or powerful in villages or in the cities, they're really starting to factor, because they develop relationships with those people working overseas, with Chinese running firms, with Chinese students that are really lower middle class, and they're actually fashioning them into leagues and political parties, into student associations, where they master tactics and exerting pressure on both the state and foreign powers. Things like the boycott of U.S. goods in 1905 in response to the Chinese Exclusion Acts, or anti-missionary activity that isn't so violent but uses newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets to question foreign Christian ownership over things like universities and hospitals and schools, and instead pressure them to actually encourage the devolution of those institutions and their ownership into Chinese hands. So they're highly nationalistic. They're very, very passionate. And Qiu Jin, in part, will inspire a lot of people through her death by their militancy, their willingness, if not to take up arms, but to lay down their lives for what they believe is China's future. And Qiu Jin is going to be executed for her part in a failed uprising against the Qing in 1907. Okay, so we have dissidents like Kong Yao-wei and Liang Qichao. We have modern politicians like Sun Zhongshan and Qiu Jin. And then we have this huge Japanese influence on what's happening that's going to put pressure on the Qing to adopt a constitution. And with that, it's really their victory on the battlefield. The Japanese are the preferred model for the Qing from their advisors for setting up a constitutional state and for modernization. And they proved that through the strength of their growing industrial economy by defeating China on the battlefield, but also through their victory in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And you can almost look at this as like two sports teams that symbolize two things, okay? And the Russians at this point symbolize an older agrarian empire headed over by a czar, by a royal dynastic family that is supreme in its political authority, Whereas Japan represents a constitution, it represents an industrial economy. And when Japan defeats Russia, even the Russian czars are going to see the writing on the wall and the need to change and to modernize, to bring in outside influences, and also to tap the potential of the populace by giving them greater rights and greater voice in society. It's also important to note that this is really the beginning then too of when Japan surpasses all others in terms of its economic ties to China. By 1914, from their concessions that they've won from the Russians in Liaodong in southern Manchuria, so inside China proper, the Japanese are going to race past Great Britain in terms of direct trade, in terms of the firms, especially railways and mining operations that they're building inside Chinese territory, but most importantly, probably through their residents, many of which are going to be the military. They're going to be soldiers living inside of Chinese territory as well. Okay. So you can read about in Spence how by 1905, 1906, the Qing are making gradual, very symbolic gestures towards constitutionalism by sending out fact-finding missions and investigative studies by princes and officials to foreign countries. And then in 1908, Empress Dowager Cixi is going to say that they are on a path to, over a course of 9 years, which is the same time period that it took Meiji Japan to move from an imperial system to a constitutional monarchy, to work towards those goals, to create a constitution, to create a national parliament, to create assemblies at the provincial, at the prefectural, and also at like the city level, to give people a semblance of self-governance. During that same course of time, they're also going to restructure the mechanisms of the state. You're going to see the 6 traditional Chinese ministries become 11 ministries that are more closely based on the style of government that you see in Western countries like Great Britain or in nearby Meiji Japan. And these 2 moves unleash an enormous period of experimentation in self-rule, where you start to see cities, market towns, rural villages, and prefectures forming representative bodies for governance, assemblies that are taking power into their own hands. And this goes beyond the intent of the Qing. They're levying new commercial and land taxes. And in some ways, what we have happening is the Qing trying to expand the infrastructure, to create more institutions of government. But at the same time, there's kind of this overlap where the people themselves are also creating new governmental institutions that have overlapping obligations. Think of this in terms of taxes. The Qing want to tax things that are commercial, such as land sales or real estate sales. And yet you also have these cities or these rural villages, or at least these prefectures that want to form assemblies that also tax those things. And you can see how that brings into tension. In part because there's this idea that one of the things that makes people modern is self-government, and that through self-government, provinces can develop. And in that respect, you start to see the provinces forming tighter identities that run counter to the capital in Beijing, where they're saying to themselves, okay, we don't think you should be able to get all that revenue, and we don't think you should control industries such as mining or railways or the military, because that's part of our provincial development. And that conflict between the state over who's going to develop these things, who's going to benefit from them, is creating a lot of tension between the center, the capital, and the outer-lying regions, or even those internal regions of China proper. And that's where the provincial assemblies really become this disruptive force, okay? The Qing intend for them to have basically an advisory role and be an outlet for public opinion. And in some respects, they are. They don't have the power necessarily to create legislation, but they are representative of a class of elites that are going to be strident in asserting their political agenda against the capital. And I'm going to stop there for a second so that I can kind of transition to video 2.